Hello, everyone. I'm Warren Darrah, and with me tonight I have Chris Copeland
Hi guys, how you going?
and Bill Flowers.
I'm here and awesome as usual.
Yeah, and together we are T.R.U. So, guys, how you been going over the last week?
Didn't bury anyone, didn't have to post bail. Another good week.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual. How about you, Bill? What have you been up to?
Just painting, really.
Yeah,
Painting and sword fighting.
painting and sword fighting. That's a great combination.
Not at the same time.
Not at the same time. Well, I've been spending a bit of time doing some spreadsheets, so it's been pretty awesome on my side of things as well. So.
There's a major shock.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe if we get a bit of time, I might tell you about some of the spreadsheets I've been putting together. I'm sure you'll find it very interesting.
Hang on a second. Give me a moment. Yeah, I just need to
Okay,
block
so
out that
yeah,
spreadsheeting.
yeah, you need the beer to hide out the spreadsheeting. So,
Well, actually, I've gone the full hipster. It's not beer tonight.
oh, okay, it's a mixer, is it?
Shit, no, I'm not that hipster. It's a cider.
So,
It's a Summersby.
A Somersby cider.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a Cascade Premium Light, which of course has two thylacines on the label, and as my darling bride tells me, they'll be the only thylacines I ever see. So obviously, she's the ultimate skeptic.
yeah.
You're going to have to
Yeah.
drink a lot of lights to see a thylacine, just quietly.
I, I think you're right. So, guys, tonight we're going to be doing our topic for discussion is if the thylacine is still extant, why don't we see them as roadkill? But before we go into that, I just want to do a bit of a quick review on the previous podcast. So, just having a look back on our YouTube channel and Facebook, really, really popular podcast. I think we were pretty well overwhelmed with the positive comments that we received. So pretty happy with the way that it was received, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great, amazingly positive comments and constructive sort of input. Fantastic. Can't wait to get this one up and see what people think.
Yeah, and look, we've also been in contact with the person that actually provided the sound recordings for us to analyse, and they also appreciated the approach that we took. And they provided some additional sort of feedback and comments, particularly on some of the things that Bill mentioned about why was it that the people who are out camping leapt to thylacine. And what they've said in relation to that is that they'd actually heard yapping sounds in the area previously, and so that's why they were thinking that it was thylacine, and also they'd taken out recording equipment with the purpose of trying to record the thylacine. They also said that there is one remote nearby farm that does have one dog, but they're 100% sure that it wasn't that dog because they were able to check with that owner. So that only deepens the mystery. And I think what they'd like us to do, or what they've approached us to do, is to actually go out there at some stage in the near future to conduct an on-site investigation, because I think we've probably got the technology and the equipment that's probably second to none, really, when it comes to conducting field experiments, in particular with vocalization. So, what do you think about that, guys?
Sounds good. What time of year was it that this recording was made? Do we know
March.
that? March. Okay.
Sounds fantastic, well, so I can't wait to get out there and sort of get our equipment running in that area and see if we can sort of record the same sound, maybe with a little bit more clarity and a little bit
Yeah,
more quality.
absolutely. With that parabolic dish and zoom that we have, I think we're going to get really good sounds, particularly seeing that was recorded only on a video camera's audio, and as we know, that they're not necessarily the best. So
We all know how awesome internal microphones are, so yeah, anything external is going to be a plus.
Okay. Sounds like a plan, mate.
yeah, okay. Well, moving right along. So tonight's question: if thylacines are still extant, why don't we see them as roadkill? Uh, I guess this is really an interesting sort of topic, and you hear a variety of opinions, and we've got about 20 comments at on the Facebook page that I'll refer to as we go along. But I'd really like to start with Chris.
Yes.
What's your view? Why don't if thylacines are still out there, like many propose they are, why don't we see them as roadkill?
I think it's just a function of how common they are. Like, a small percentage of each species gets struck by vehicles per year. So let's say, for argument's sake, and ease of calculation, that that's 5%. Realistically, 5% of a big number's an observable number. So you see a lot of Tasmanian paddymelons hit by vehicles, and 5% of a small or non-existent number is a very small number, and so therefore we're possibly not seeing it. It may take years and years and years to actually identify one if they're still out there, or it may be a real good indication that they're actually not out there.
Mm. What's your view to start us off here, Bill?
A few interesting thoughts about it. Yeah, the animals that are fairly low in number, like say spotted tail quoll, we do see them as roadkill. It is one thing we do see. What I don't notice very often though is eastern grey kangaroo.
Have you spent
Very
much time
rarely.
in the northeast?
Sorry?
Have you spent much time up the northeast?
Yeah, I drive through to St Helens quite often, and I don't normally see them. Yeah, so I don't know. It's just a bigger animal would be something that people would slow down for.
Yeah.
Is one thing. We get plenty of reports of people seeing them running across the road. A bigger target, maybe somebody hit the brakes more that don't want to damage their car,
Mm.
is one possibility. Where a small thing would just go under the tyres anyway.
Well, Bill, I think that's a really good point. It provides a really good example for me to refer to my spreadsheet. And one of the things that we know about thylacine sightings is that the vast majority of thylacine sightings happen basically when people are driving. So they happen at night, people are driving, got a single driver. So that would kind of say that they are still active around these roadways. So there must be some sort of probability that they're going to get hit by a car.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think one of the myths that we've got to sort of address here is the whole southwest thing. Like, admittedly, there's not much infrastructure in the southwest, but there's not a lot of historic record for thylacine in the southwest either. So realistically, we as the human population of Tasmania are in the areas that have got a higher degree of productivity, therefore more prey animals and historically more predators. So, I mean, if they're out there, then eventually you're going to see them on the road. A road's a transect through an area, and it's just like walking a trap line or something like that. If they're there, you'll eventually see them, surely.
Yeah, look, I think that there's a couple of good points that you've got there, Chris, and I think fundamentally what jumps out for me and what you said is that to have a sighting of a thylacine, you have to have both a thylacine and a person. So if you don't have the infrastructure that attracts people, well, then you're not going to have the people side of that. So that's the first thing, and then what goes along with that is that you're not going to have the roads that the people are on. So one of the things that also comes to mind is one of the pieces that Bill did some time ago on one of our earlier T.R.U. YouTube videos about what happens around roadways when people actually clear the area around roads, so the bush and the scrub. That then brings in the um, the herbivores to graze in that area, and that then brings in the carnivores to prey on those herbivores. Bill, do you think that that would increase the likelihood that you would see a thylacine by the roadway?
Um, yeah, and I suppose the other thing that probably should mention too is that if you've got a healthy population of Tasmanian devils, they will often remove things off the road as well. That's a possibility. Um, But having said that, I seem to remember about 10 years ago when their population was devastated in the northeast. I drove through there and saw lots of skeletons on the side of the road. So at that time, the northeast being one of the supposed hotspots for thylacine, we didn't see any roadkill at that time.
Chris, just coming on from that point that Bill made, you're inverted commas an expert in the Tasmanian devil. So everybody missed me just doing the rabbit ears in the air there. So there's a lot of people out there who sort of say, well, the reason we don't find thylacine carcasses by the side of the road or anywhere else for that matter is because that the Tasmanian devil population are eating every single trace of these deceased thylacines. Is that a realistic thing in your view that a devil's going to eat every scrap of a thylacine carcass?
If we were dealing with a small animal, yes. If we're dealing with something that's maybe, 3.5 times bigger than a Tasmanian devil, I'd say no. Like, your likelihood of a devil actually removing 100% of a thylacine carcass, in my opinion, is pretty low. You just have to look at the way that devils approach the eating of a wombat carcass or something like that to see that a reasonable percentage of that is actually indigestible for a devil and they won't touch it.
Mm. And particularly things like the actual skull, which I think is clearly identifiable as what species it's come from. We've been walking through the Tasmanian bush and we've found wombat skulls, for example. So
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of those wombat skulls are clearly recognisable having been killed by Tasmanian devil because the correct part of that skull is removed. So yeah, they'll certainly have a go at carcass that size, but the whole front section of the skull that the facial mask sits on is usually not touched on something the size of a wombat, and I would personally assume that that would be the same if a devil was trying to tackle a thylacine carcass.
mm,
I think the thing with wombat though is a wombat's very hard for them to chew up. They do leave a lot of that behind, whereas with say a Bennett's wallaby, they will remove pretty much all of that.
I
Uh,
disagree, but anyway.
I have
yeah, because I guess
just
the other thing is we've also
just my
found
experience.
skulls of wallabies in the bush as well. So in fact, I recall Chris, you and I finding a couple of skulls outside of what was clearly a devil den,
Mm,
so
mm.
that had been cast aside. So
And
Well, I just throw in another point here too, is that I think in the grand scheme of things, devils are much more likely to go for a paddy melon, a wallaby, than they are to go for a another carnivore. Um, just I have noticed that, when you try and feed goat or something unusual to the devils, they will just look at it for a while and only go for it when another devil does. Whereas if they're used to eating a certain food source, they'll stick to that food source. So something unusual, I think they have to be hungry to have a go at it.
I I see your point, but it's sort of ultimately for something like the example you use, goat, it's not an animal that they've evolved with, and it's a big carcass. So therefore, they're instinctively going to be very, very cautious, as devils and quolls are. So they're probably sort of having to take their time because they don't have an instinct that it's food because they haven't ever struck goat in their evolutionary sort of timescale.
Yeah, but something like a thylacine is something that they would avoid. The smell of it is something they would avoid. They want to make sure it's dead before they go near it. And so what I'm saying is they'd probably be very cautious to go towards a thylacine carcass on the side of the road, whereas when there's plenty of wallabies on the side of the road, they're definitely going to take those.
So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I imagine a devil would be very, very cautious
And
of.
so if you've got a thylacine on the side of the road, you definitely have wallabies there too, because there has to be a food source for the thylacine.
Mm.
mm,
Can I just, before we get too far away from where I could foresee I bring it up, Warren, can I just bring up one of the comments I saw on the Facebook page this afternoon when I was having a look, doing the sort of preparing for this, and it was a comment like, and I can't unfortunately remember who did it, and I don't have it in front of me. I should have written it down, but there was a comment that sort of was made, maybe by Brigo, about cars travelling 80 kilometres on the road in Tasmania. I mean, you've spent enough time with me, mate. I don't drive 80, and our mate Max, he certainly doesn't drive 80 either. And I think you'll find that as a local, you don't. You know the roads, you know the degree of threat that something like a paddy melon. Like, I'd be lucky to do 80 ever driving home at night, and I work in a remote area, and I drive home anywhere up to midnight every night. So it's sort of, and no disrespect to Brigo, but on the ground in Tasmania, I think we drive a lot quicker than people imagine.
Yeah, look, I think that it was one of the things that I saw. So, yeah, definitely Steve Brigginshaw, Brigo, he's basically saying that what's he saying? Given if extant, they are likely very few and they're nocturnal and probably well away from frequently used roads.
Which I don't disagree with.
Yeah, from roads that are driven at over, or fewer roads that are driven at over 80 kilometres per hour, very elusive. So one of the things that I sort of think of is when I go to Tasmania, there seems to be, particularly on the quieter roads, I'm not talking about the highways that are 110 kilometres an hour, that there seems to be fewer people driving at night. And I can absolutely understand why that would be, is because the absolute proliferation of wildlife that comes out at night. And, I remember some very scary drives sort of over the Great Lakes sort of areas where there is just so much wildlife crossing those unsealed roads that, if you went 80 kilometres an hour, you would be hitting every other animal. And so, yeah, it's an interesting point. So I'm not sure whether you guys would consciously drive less at night, do you think? You don't? Well, you can't avoid it, Chris, because you've got to drive home.
Yeah.
Well, I used to work where Chris worked, and I used to either stay there or I used to drive about 60 kilometres an hour to get home, weaving amongst the possums and the wallabies.
Yeah, well, look, that sort of brings...
Not really anything, which is good.
The Sprigo's responded to a post, a really good post from Mark Crooks here, where he's saying the estimated roadkill for Tasmania per year is 293,000 animals. Brush-tailed possums, 108,000. Paddy melon, 28,000. Wallaby, so Bennett's wallaby, 15,000. Tasmanian devil, 3,392. So that's a nice pyramid shape there, isn't it, in terms of the actual density of those animals that's being represented. So you would expect with that if Thylacine was still out there, that you would see a much smaller number hit, but still you would see some.
For sure. Do we have a reference for that? Because actually those estimates are fairly low to some of the ones I've heard.
Yeah, it just says here Tasmanian roadkill statistics, so I'm not sure where that's happening. It says 50% of roadkills happen where vehicles travel at over 80 kilometres an hour.
Doesn't surprise me. I can't cite a reference for it either, but I've heard sort of people talk of, and they're possibly even exaggerations, but I've heard sort of ideas of anything up to 1 million mammals hit by cars in Tasmania currently. And as devil numbers have collapsed through devil facial tumor disease, sort of some of their preferred prey items have gone skyward in number, so those figures could be a little bit outdated as well, but I've got nothing to cite either. I was just curious whether you knew where they'd come from.
No, it's certainly something I can sort of follow up after this. But I think that's always one of the surprising things. I think when people go to Tasmania, the actual density of animals on the island, allows that to happen in terms of, no one's saying, for example, that brush-tailed possums are in danger or paddy melons are in danger in Tasmania, and yet they are so frequently hit by cars. So
Do you think it's possibly that, like, sort of without a, let's say, a viable population of thylacine, like, if they're out there, their population density is probably pretty low. There may be a functionally extinct population out there, one that can't really keep a grip on the ecology that surrounds it.
mm,
Devil numbers have collapsed. Spotted tail quail numbers have collapsed. So, is car acting as the top order predator these days?
yeah, well, that's a really good point, isn't it? In terms of the fact that that's the big equalizer. I think one of the other things that looking at some of these other posts and is that what we're saying that thylacine maybe they're extinct, and as evidenced by the fact that no one finds them as roadkill. But we need to really point out, is that because no one reports the fact that they've hit a thylacine? And what would someone actually do if they did hit a thylacine? And I think that there's a couple of posts where
Mm.
people have basically intimated that and sort of said, well, did they want to be the person who ran over, a believed to be extinct animal, and that's what their claim to fame was? And I think it's a pretty good point. What do you reckon, guys?
You go, Bill.
I sort of imagine that they just get out a rag and polish the front of the car, get all the blood off, and say, "Hey, look, somebody's hit a thylacine.
Yeah, yeah,
What's that about that?"
yeah. So that's what you would do, Bill. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. For me, it's funny reading those comments. Actually, did hit a bit of a nerve because I spend a lot of time driving at night on remote roads, and I've certainly had that sort of internal monologue with myself, like driving along, like, what if I'm the one that hits the last remaining thylacine? Those comments did actually sort of resonate with me because I'd certainly had those thoughts before in the past.
Well, there's a comment here, and it's from Aaron Hilaire that says, "Imagine killing one with your car and having to tell someone that you killed it, and the news would make it all over the world. Thylacine found alive, and Aaron killed it."
Yeah.
And that's going to be stored in the record books for all time. And it's a really good point, but I think. I remember being told a story by a mutual contact of ours. I think Steve was his name, saying that there was a female cyclist who was riding around Tasmania who went missing. And the story that he was saying is, well, and relating it back to thylacine, was that this person very well could have been hit by a car, and they've covered it up, been knocked off the side of the road, and then the devils come in and clean them up, and no trace, disappeared.
Yeah, what you're talking about there's a fairly famous case in Tasmania, and I don't really want to go there, but there's certainly theories like that. There's also that was potentially a murder thing, and that's why I don't really want to go there.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
the
And the other thing is also police do find human remains, maybe in pieces, but they do find them.
Mm.
the comment from under the one you just mentioned by a gentleman by the name of Martin Banks under Aaron's comment.
Yeah.
I think he brings up a good point here. But it would indeed be mortifying, but still accidental, and in the bigger picture, supply real evidence of its survival. That would be so valuable, it would outweigh all other considerations, I think.
Mm.
I think that's a fairly good point. I mean, like, it's sort of similar to these crypto monsters and things like that. You need more than, biologically, you need more than one lake monster to maintain a population. You need a critical mass of them. So if someone did hit one, then it's very, very unlikely that it's the last one.
Yeah.
That is
Absolutely.
a good point.
After this time frame that we're talking, 36 to current, I mean, if they're still there, I mean, the sort of thought was 8 to 12 life expectancy, etc., etc., etc. Like, bottom line, there's got to be more than one. So Martin Banks probably brings up a real good point there in response to Aaron's.
Yeah, look, and it's certainly something that if you look at the fine and all of that sort of thing that might happen, if you got fined because it's an accident, right? It's not like you were out there shooting it in this particular incident. That I'm sure it would be dwarfed by the media attention and the checks you'd get for saying, tell us what happened when you ran over this endangered animal, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, so I think
I
that's
think
right.
if there were skid marks leading up to it, you might get away with it.
Yeah,
I think like realistically, the sort of that's exactly right. Like it's sort of, I think you would be unlikely to be fined because they wouldn't be able to prove the sort of malicious intent and things like that. It would provide that body for sure, and that's realistically that's the argument you hear sort of with all those shooting Sasquatch sort of TV shows and things like that. That the body is finite proof, basically.
Mm. Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that particular word, Chris, of Sasquatch.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so
Did
because one of the
Did you
one
say
of the
Summersby?
some
Sorry, I just cracked another one.
we're only limited to a certain amount of beers per episode, Chris, so be careful there. So one of the comments that is posted here that opens up a bit of a can of worms, I guess, is something about the fact that the thylacines have essentially adapted to say, like Sasquatch, to stay well clear of cars. What do we think about the fact that in the 100 or so years that I guess thylacine could have potentially been exposed to the sound of the internal combustion engine, that they would have learnt to be wary of it?
I think like adaptation is possible, etc. I just personally think we've got to be very cautious of giving these animals supernatural powers and things like
Yeah.
that. And there's a couple of comments in that that we've struck and over the time we've been doing this, and like adaptation's possible, but these were definitely and could still be question mark flesh and blood animals. They're not supernatural. It's sort of
Yeah.
like trout fishermen almost talk about trout in a sort of hushed tone, and I don't mind a bit of trout fishing, and it does happen, but they are just skin and bone animal like us.
I've got another thing to add to that though. Um, what if they've not adapted? What if they've always been afraid of the combustion engine?
Are you talking like time slip here, or interdimensional, or don't?
Well, there's that. Well, you sort of think about the combustion engine, all that. It didn't really happen until these guys were on the way to extinction. It wasn't ever really roadkill of thylacine. Maybe they've always been afraid of the noise of a motor running.
So you're talking very early 1900s for motorcycles and things like that. So, I mean,
Yeah,
that's yeah. Um,
yeah. It's a bloody terrible noise.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Looking at my fantastic spreadsheet that I have in front of me, the statistics would kind of say that isn't true because there's 158 sightings that have been recorded over the years where people have been driving in a motor vehicle either on road or off road.
Right.
So that would kind of say, particularly when we think that a lot of these sightings are happening in remote parts of Tasmania, that they're going to hear the car from a long way away, right? So there's plenty of opportunity to get away, and yet people still see them, if indeed they actually are seeing thylacines.
Yeah, well, there you go.
yeah, and that's always the if. Like, if you assume that that's what they're seeing, And I'm not saying that they're still out there, but if we're assuming that's what they're seeing, then yeah, absolutely, you've got a strong point. Maybe maybe they're curious of vehicles. Like, I mean, we were talking about roadkill, sort of paddy melons and the sheer number. Maybe they're curious.
Mm. And look, I think it's one of the things that if you have a casual glance through Dr. Robert Paddle's book, he talks about the observation of thylacine behaviour in the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, versus, say, the mid 19th century, to say how that they're quite contrasting reviews. And one of the reasons that he suggests for that is because of the decline of the thylacine population that happens over the bounty years, but mainly because of things like the disease that they were said to have, and the fact that that disease in many ways changed their behaviours. So, what was previously a very, I guess, shy and retiring animal, because of sickness, started to go places that they wouldn't normally go to try and get that scavenger type meal, and maybe that's why they would be more likely to be seen in roads.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, Bill.
Oh, one thing we haven't really mentioned or touched upon, and I'm sure those who are very well up with reading about thylacine would have mentioned it or would have thought about it, and that is in Cole Bailey's book, Shadow of the Thylacine. He mentions about a UK couple who were cycling, and they found the body of what they believe was a thylacine at the Elephant Pass near St Mary's.
Yep.
Have you heard that story?
I have, but continue for the listener that has not.
Yeah, well, the idea is that Cole was giving a talk and he was sort of saying how there's not much in the way of roadkill, and then a couple approached him and said that they had been cycling and that they had seen a strange dog-like animal with a kangaroo-like tail on the side of the road. They sort of stopped briefly but kept moving because it was in a very dangerous part of the road. They couldn't really stop. And then they went to the museum in Hobart, saw the Thylacine exhibition, and then thought, yep, they've just seen a thylacine. So that's pretty much the story.
Mm.
Always sort of gets me though, people, they sort of, they say, oh yeah, it was a thylacine after they've seen a picture of one or something.
I think the mine's had some time.
Yeah, that sort of sounds like confirmation sort of bias to me. They go and they see the thylacine exhibit, and the mind sort of fills in the blanks, and suddenly that's what they've seen. So
I just often wonder about that because, like, stuffed thylacine wouldn't really look like, wouldn't look that natural. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They don't even look like thylacines. They look like stuffed wallabies with stripes, but.
Well, some of them are stuffed wallabies with stripes, aren't they?
Allegedly.
Yeah. Well, I guess that, just to take the discussion on a bit of a tangent, there's a fair population of people out there who are interested in thylacine, who believe that the thylacine may be still extant on the mainland. So the mainland doesn't have a Tasmanian devil population that we know of. So if the thylacine is extant on the mainland, why wouldn't we see roadkill there in comparison to Tasmania? Bill?
You got me there. Once again, I would assume that if thylacine is on mainland Australia, it is in some very remote areas. And, I don't know, maybe they're a bit more cluey there. I mean, we see emu, we see kangaroos, we see large animals dead on the side of the road all over Australia. Yeah, I don't know.
What do you reckon, Chris?
I think it's a very, very good point. Realistically, if something's there given enough time, you're probably going to get evidence of it as the road is a transect through its habitat.
Yeah.
See, when you think I've seen platypuses roadkill a couple of times.
Oh, it happens outside Sheffield alarmingly frequently.
Okay. So there's a lot of animals you wouldn't expect to see on the road, but you do.
Yeah.
So just going back to the Facebook comments, Chella here says maybe the remains are removed by the surviving mate. What do we think about that, Chris?
Unlikely.
Unlikely.
I would say that this is sort of bordering on sort of like giving them too much compared to what we know of devils and quolls and things like that. All the marsupial carnivores are solitary animals. Whilst
Yep.
they do pair up to mate, the male then disperses from the female and the female raises the young. Devils more den guard than they do bond. They're not monogamous or anything like that. They've got a polygamy mating system and things like that. I think it's very, very unlikely that they would have enough sort of altruism and recognition of one another and social bond to remove a carcass from the road of a mate.
What do you reckon, Bill?
It would be not easy for them to remove a carcass.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Grab it, heave it. It's a lot of effort to go to. It would have to get there and think, oh, okay, my mate's sick or my mate's, dead. And either way, would they really think that much? I don't know.
I guess the obvious thing for me there is that sort of presupposes that it's one of a mating pair or a family group that's actually been struck by the car. And I think if we again look at the great spreadsheet that I've got of, I guess, 500 or so sightings, about 80% of the sightings are of a single animal. So just as if they are out there, the likelihood that you've actually hit one of a pair as opposed to just happen to be a single animal, you'd still think that you'd hit a single animal as often as you'd hit one of a pair, wouldn't you? So
For sure.
So it kind of rules that out as well, I would think.
So a social animal like a dog, what did you and I see out the back of Mile Creek, Warren? What bailed us up? A pair of dogs.
Yes, yeah.
So, they're gregarious, they're sort of, they're socially orientated. The marsupial carnivores, in my experience, aren't. So,
Yeah.
I just can't see it personally.
Well, I think there was another important observation in that particular incident, and that was I was quite prepared to injure you somehow so that they would attack you and drag you away so that I could make a clean getaway. So that needs to be declared as well, I think. So
I was going the old adage, one doesn't have to be the fastest runner in the world, just faster than you.
Yeah, and that would have been pretty apt in that sort of situation. So
I think Warren's less than you.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
I suppose just to cap off the whole idea of one removing, I mean, the other thing I think of is when you see possums on the side of the road, their mate comes along, their mate usually starts eating the possum.
For sure.
So, cannibalism happens.
Yep.
I guess that's the marsupial mind for you. I don't know.
I'm not sort of dismissing them and their intelligence and adaptability or anything like that. Not at all. Like you read all the historic sort of writings about Tasmanian devil, and they make them out to be dull and stupid. And in my experience, they're not at all. But you're dead right, Bill. Like it's sort of they're not real altruistic. So ultimately, if one's injured or one's vulnerable or one's dead, in my experience, it's food.
Mm.
If it was to take it away from the road, what would the purpose of that be? Just put intelligence aside and just say instinctively.
Mm-hmm.
Any instinctive reason for it to remove it from the side of the road?
Because they don't like open space and they feel threatened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a long shot, isn't it?
Oh, I don't think so, but anyway, it's like...
I mean, it's a long shot for them to actually, grab their
Oh,
mate and go
Yeah,
off.
yeah. Sorry, yeah, I misinterpreted what you said there, but yeah, for sure, like long
Yeah,
shot.
yeah. Open space, feeling threatened.
Yep,
That makes a lot of sense.
they just like
For
bugger off the
everything.
road.
Yeah. Okay, so now a comment here by Michael Prater says
Hmm.
that he thinks it comes down to mathematics. If they do still exist, it is in small numbers, then you have to get one that is not scared by the sound of a car. Then you have to have one that is silly enough to run in front of a car. Then the thylacine has to be hit in a way that causes instantaneous death rather than a glancing blow or a blow that enables it to crawl away and die in the bush. It would also require the driver to not stop and remove the deceased animal from the road. So for me, this all points to the fact that it is unlikely proposition to happen once, let alone make it a regular occurrence. So what do we think about that, Chris?
I agree. It's sort of their numbers are low, and as Michael said, you have to meet some parameters. But 1936 to current, you would have thought those parameters would have been met. So,
Yeah,
like, let's take, and I'm not saying this is the figure, but let's take 5%. If there's 100 thylacines out there and 5% of them had been hit by vehicles over the year, that's still a recordable number.
absolutely.
So, like, no matter how low the population is, surely given enough time, uh, you would have some documented evidence.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I think for me, the whole area of the mathematics of thylacine numbers and statistics is really quite interesting. I know that we've had a couple of in-depth discussions about it in terms of the minimal viable population and those sorts of things. And when we think about the number of thylacines that were killed over the 29 years of the bounty, something like 2,208. Now, when you look at that in any one year, if we assume that the thylacine population started at 2,500, there's no more than 10% of the population that was ever
Yep.
killed by bounty in any one year. So that's not enough thylacines to be hunted out of existence. So something is either wrong with the starting number of 2,500, or some other thing like the diseases has taken care of them.
I think, unless Bill's going to jump in there, but
I was gonna say the other thing about this is maybe thylacines are rather regional in that they will stay in certain areas, and in those certain areas that they have survived, less likely to be cars there.
Mm.
So they're not probably not coming in contact with cars as common
Yep.
as say some of the other animals that are all pretty much distribution all widespread across the whole state.
Well, interestingly, I was just thinking, Chris, that we've parked T.R.U. one by the side of a road, a fairly well kept road, well structured road, and we haven't seen another car for a couple of days. So, you could have had a whole menagerie of thylacines running up and down that particular road at any given time, and no one would have seen a thing, so let alone been hit. So,
yeah, for sure.
and they're right in the middle of those areas that Bill is talking about. In those much less populated areas, there are still roads.
Hmm.
Yeah. What about, I don't know if it's been commented upon, but like, would the famous thylacine migration theory impact upon this? Surely, if you've got thylacines that are instinctively funneling down a certain pathway to move from one viable habitat to another, and a road transects that, then it's sort of going to increase the number of individuals hit and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The thylacine corridor theory that's put forward in the shadow of a thylacine. In fact, a number of those corridors, there's a couple of roads that do get passed, would have to be crossed, but most of them are relatively minor in terms of the size of the road, sort of dual carriageway size, sort of the country road type thing. But interestingly, if they were crossing in those limited points, you'd also think that would point to some pretty narrow corridors where you could actually observe the animals as well. and also narrow corridors to actually inspect the sides of the roads for carcasses. So,
Just when you refer to minor road as dual carriageway, just remember that in probably 8/10 of it, the main highway in Tasmania is only a dual carriageway.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I know that's that. I guess that's why I'm sort of saying more, a country sort of road sort of thing rather than what we think of as the 110 zones and whatnot. So, mm, mm.
When you say 110, are we talking me or Bill?
Yeah. Well, we know that Bill has never ever driven at 110 kilometres an hour, so it's a bit of a moot point, right? I think that's. I know it's one of the ways that you get him to be quiet in the car, Chris, is just to increase the speed.
Put the foot down and let him panic. Yep.
That's right. So interspersed with the occasional Tassie Tiger vocalisation in the back of the car.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just no way to get to Valhalla for me, I'm afraid.
Okay, some other comments that we got here. It's an interesting question. The population is most likely terrified of humans. Like most other animals, they keep away from roads any ways they can. If they must cross a road, they might do so at night when very little cars are driving, or maybe they're just smart enough, fast enough to move out of the car's way and not get hit. So that's from Steve Marsho. What do we think about that one, Bill?
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering what's going to happen when we all start driving hybrids and not making much noise.
Well, it's never going to happen, so...
No, I think the oil companies have got too much of a vested interest in keeping us driving the internal combustion engine, right? So,
yeah, okay. Well, getting back to what you're saying, yeah. Well, again, that's sort of what I was saying before. Maybe they are afraid of the noise of a car, and most of them do keep out of the way. But having said that, you're still going to surprise one, I guess. If the sound's not carrying the right way, they whiz around the corner and there's a thylacine. And also maybe they're quick on their feet. Maybe they can get out of the way quicker than a lot of other animals. Maybe they don't have the thing where wallabies will sort of eat on one side of the road. You come along and they try to get back home, which is in front of your car, to the other side.
mm.
Maybe thylacines are more... just keep going the other direction out. I don't know.
What about their likelihood of them being sort of mesmerised by car lights? Some animals you go out spotlighting, catch them in the bright lights, and they'll be hypnotised or fixated on the lights. What's the story with the other marsupial carnivores, Chris, when it comes to that type of phenomenon?
Most of them you can hold in position using a spotlight. Absolutely. That's a real good point. I hadn't really sort of thought about that in the lead up to doing this podcast, but that's a real good point, Warren.
And look, and I guess that's one of the reasons why it sort of makes sense using different coloured filters and those sorts of things when you go out there spotlighting in terms of using things like a red filter or a green filter and those sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'm just going through some of these last comments that we have here. Benjamin Laverley, the thylacines are still alive! Exclamation mark.
Later on, he states they've learnt to fear man like Sasquatch has.
Yeah. Well, we certainly know that our Sasquatch doesn't fear any man, and why would he with such a manly beard like the one he has?
Yes, but he wants to drive a hybrid, so.
Yeah, that has actually that is a little bit hipster actually. I'm a bit worried.
Next, he'll be becoming a barista.
A barista. Okay. Yeah, he might. With all his sword fighting, he may have got barista confused with ballista. So.
Berserker.
Berserker. Yeah. So again, Margaret Kim Aitken here. The question I put forward is how many would actually report a thylacine roadkill. I guess we've sort of really discussed that. I think, you would obviously get some people who would head for the hills, but then you'd probably get other people who, even if it was anonymous, put the body somewhere obvious, like in the front of a police station or a vet clinic or something like that, so that it would be discovered, but not necessarily attributed to anyone else. So,
We haven't addressed one directly, but there's a lot of very good comments from Rick Van Midden.
yes,
Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, but yeah, there's this gentleman's obviously thought about this a lot.
yeah. Yeah, so Rick's got a couple of really good comments here, as all the comments are. It leads to another question. In our first podcast, you mentioned your confirmed sightings of wild dogs in remote areas. Could the thylacine coexist with wild dogs? If wild dogs hunt in an organised pack, would the thylacine be vulnerable and potential prey to a pack of dogs? A theory in the mainland is that thylacine couldn't compete with a dingo. If thylacines currently still roam in Tasmanian wilderness, are they still the apex predator, presuming they once were? Christopher, you're the world-class zoologist. What do you think?
I think if thylacine is still out there, it's probably going to be a functionally extinct population, and I strongly believe that something like dog could have replaced them. So you could potentially have a handful of them, and they haven't kept a grip on the niche that they filled. The dog fulfills that niche, and I sort of strongly believe that dogs would be a threat to a thylacine just purely because they're a social animal. They're a threat to devil, they're a threat to quail. I cannot see why a pack of dogs would not be a threat to a thylacine.
What do you reckon, Bill?
Well, unless you believe a lot of the reports that the dogs are terrified of thylacines.
Yeah, look, I think that's an interesting point. I think it's well documented that dogs are terrified of thylacines, but I think that's typically where you have a lone dog, maybe a couple of dogs,
or a pet dog that's got a full belly.
Yeah, that's right, and I think one of the things that I remember Chris telling me one dark and stormy night out in the middle of the wilderness nowhere.
What happens in the field stays in the field, Warren?
I'm only going to tell part of it.
Okay,
Chris,
right, yeah.
Don't be worried. the
Not worried.
Yeah, Bill, come on. The thing with dogs is that most of the dogs, certainly that we've run across, are clearly dump dogs rather than dogs that have actually been bred in the wild. And they seem to have a bit of a rough time of it. And I think one of the things that Chris said to me is that a wild dog has got a much lower life expectancy because of how tough it actually is out there. Something of the order of about 5 years, I think. From memory. So I just wonder whether the likelihood of packs of dogs in Tasmania are lower because of the fact that a lot of them are dump dogs rather than breeding packs per se.
I wish I could meet this Chris guy.
He's very, very knowledgeable fellow, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with your sort of recollection of that story, Warren.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, yeah, like if you have multi-generational sort of feral dog, they're under natural selection. There's a selection pressure. If you survive, you breed. If not, you don't. I think the longer that they're out there as a sort of a population, the more adapted, the more evolved they're going to be to the environment. A dump dog's just going to be thrown in the deep end and run the risk of starvation very quickly.
I guess the other thing too is what made dingo have it all over thylacines and devils was not just the pack hunting, it's also the fact they could regulate their body temperature by panting, by sticking their tongue out. And it's probably not as much of an issue in Tasmania, so we're probably not getting those packs of dogs, and thylacines, potentially could survive in a cooler climate easier
Yeah,
against the competition.
I think one of the other competitive advantages that the dingo would have had was the fact that it was, at the very least, semi-domesticated by the Australian Aboriginal, so they're quite often hunting along with man. So, um, and so there you have two top order predators, if you like, trying to take on a thylacine. So, and thylacine would have been good food for both, I would have thought.
Bam, agree.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily actually agree with the thermoregulation idea, but the semi-domestication of dingo, social hunting, and this sort of coordination of two top order predators together, yeah, agree.
Mm, mm.
Which again, we're probably not happening in Tasmania.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we're sitting here having this conversation because those animals seemingly survived into sort of modern time, colonial history of Tasmania, the Thylacine and the devil, basically, because there was no dingo in Tasmania.
Mm,
Mm.
mm.
If dingo, in my opinion, had have arrived in Tasmania, I'd be on the couch with a few more Summersbys under my belt. We wouldn't be having this conversation because they just wouldn't have been here. That'd just be in the fossil record rather than like an extant species that people looked at and sort of thought was a threat and put pressure on, etc., etc.
Yeah. Okay, guys, time to wrap up. So,
You're
in
gonna
con
have to word this skeptometer fairly particularly, I think, Warren.
yeah, I was just thinking that very same point, Chris. So, in conclusion, Chris, why do you think we don't see, if thylacine are still extant? Why wouldn't we be seeing them hit as roadkill? And what would be, I guess, your skeptometer on that particular theory that you're about to put forward?
If thylacine were extant, I strongly believe we would have documented one as roadkill.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's about the size of it.
Yep.
I think so. If thylacine was extant, would we have seen one as roadkill? Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Bill, what do you reckon?
Uh, yeah, well, I've always sort of thought, why aren't we seeing them as roadkill? And I guess the only conclusion I can come to is if they are still out there, is that they are in very regional pockets, far away from the main traffic activity.
Mm.
But why? Like, how could they exist in that area? Like, what's the food? What's the plant communities in all those areas? It tends to be sort of mixed forest and temperate rainforest. I just struggle with the idea that there'd be enough food source and viability to maintain a top order predator in some of those bits. I just strongly believe that sort of we are in the same part of Tasmania as the Thylacine was historically for the same reason that they were there. So I just go back to the idea that they would have had to have been hit by cars if they're still out there.
Mm. Yeah, look, I think I want to have, I guess, a bet each way in this particular thing. I think that there's potential that there is enough habitat in some of these remote areas in terms of saying that that there's sufficient prey for them to prey upon in small numbers of top order carnivores, and maybe they have been hit by cars, as the anecdotal story by Cole Bailey would suggest, but they just haven't been reported by the appropriate people. So, but it is a perplexing sort of question. I would have thought, as you rightly say, Chris, that that there would have been a report made by now.
Yep. Sorry, it's not a particularly exciting conclusion on my behalf. Sorry, Warren. It's just pretty succinct in my mind.
Yeah, look, no, and look, and that's what we're here to do is to weigh up all of the variables and come to a conclusion. It doesn't mean that we're saying it's impossible that the thylacine is still out there. It's just to say
The
there's
balance
a
of
number.
probabilities. Yeah.
That's right. It's a number of unlikely scenarios have to be ticked off for it to be the case. So guys, that really wraps up the podcast that we have for tonight. I'd like to suggest that the next time we meet, we tackle a rather an interesting piece of alleged thylacine evidence, and that's the famous or infamous even Doyle footage that was taken in the early 70s in South Australia, and some suggest is the best recorded evidence for the thylacine existing post 1936. So I can't wait till we have a look at that video and hear your views on it.
On the flip side, I can't wait to hear your views. I know you're feel fairly strong about this, so yeah, I can't wait to hear your views.
Yeah, Bill, I'm sure you're equally familiar with the piece of footage that we're talking about.
He can't be because he just dropped out.
Oh, okay. Well, that's probably the best thing to happen. It keeps him quiet. So, look, thanks everybody for listening and tuning into this podcast. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please put them in Facebook, or if you're listening to this through YouTube, do it there. Also, we're really happy to hear any suggestions that you might have on future topics. Just let us know. So, that's it for me. See you later.
Thanks, guys. Don't forget at T.R.U crew on Twitter. You can tweet us, and we might sort of do a bit of live tweeting and maybe a bit of live interaction with people down the track on Twitter. Cheers.
Hello, those are back.
Yeah, it's back. Okay, Bill, you've got it. We're just saying goodbye. Uh, you can't script stuff like that. Okay, guys, see you later. Talk to you next time.